Hello, my name is Santa Matt, and I'm a volunteer at Factory 2. I'm there several times a week, and if you have questions, come down and see us, and I will answer them in person. Factory 2 is in Flint, Michigan, and it's on Grand Traverse, right north of where the river crosses. Welcome to Soldering 101. Today we're going to talk about soldering circuit boards and wires so that you can make electronic projects. What you see right here is my soldering workstation. I took a cheap little multi-drawered cart, made a wood top for it, attached a light, a magnifier light. If I get it into the camera here, there we go. So that I can get a better look at what I'm doing, I attached a circuit board holder for holding wire or whatever I want to solder. Then of course I have on here my soldering iron. Soldering irons come in a number of different forms. Most of them will look pretty much like this right here. Okay, these are the cheap ones. You can get them for under $5, but they are limited. This is called a soldering station, and it has a pad down here, which is a small sponge which you can keep damp and help you clean your soldering tip. It has a control panel here where you can adjust the temperature of the soldering tip. We'll talk more about temperature in a bit. Okay, and it gives you a nice place to fight with the soldering iron. Gives you a nice place to set the soldering iron while it's hot without burning or melting anything. And then, of course, there's the ubiquitous soldering guns. Weller and Wren both make them, and they got two metal bars and a copper tip, and they're typically way too powerful for any kind of electronic circuitry. They're more for soldering power wiring and that. So if you're doing power supply wiring, by all means use the soldering gun. I do, because they're a lot faster than an iron. They got about 4 to 5 times the power and heat energy of a soldering iron. While we're talking about heat, you have to get your work surface hot enough to melt lead, to melt solder. That amount of heat will quite often destroy electronic components, melt LEDs, the plastic that they're made out of and whatnot. So heat is both required, but it's also your enemy. So there are two schools of thought on the heat that you should use on the soldering iron and what you set this dial to here on the soldering controller. The first one is turn it all the way up and solder fast. The other one is turn it down to where it will just barely melt solder and there's not enough heat energy to radiate out much further than the immediate area you're working on. The first method is what I prefer, but you have to be fast. You have to know what it looks like, because that heat will melt insulation on wires and destroy components, etc. I'll explain as we go by some of the techniques I use to be able to solder faster. The second one is quite a bit slower and at times can make an inferior joint, but it is the safest way to solder. And the closer you get to your actual electronic components when you're soldering, the more you're going to want to use method 2. Other tools that you will find useful, if not required, when you solder are a good pair of strippers. Okay, these strippers happen to be made by Klein Tools. They're some of the best you can get. They're a little on the expensive side, but the primary thing is you see these holes here along the edge. When you come together, that leaves a little bit of a gap through there. Okay, you want one with the smallest hole to be as small as possible, because your wiring that you're going to be using. This particular one, wire is measured in gauge, and the higher the number, the smaller the wire. This particular set goes down to gauge 20. If you can find them, 22, 24, or even a set of 26s, if you can find them, would be ideal for the type of soldering we're doing. If you don't have that and you have the 20, you can take a piece of wire, okay? This happens to be 22 gauge, and when you put it in the stripper to get a tighter fit, you just pull it to the side a little bit like that. Oh, wrong direction. And there we go, stripped. All right, but they need to be sharp. If they get dull and they start nicking the wire, which I wasn't particularly careful there, and there's a nick in this wire you can't see, but that will be a weak spot where it could break. If they get old and they get dull, buy new ones. Not worth messing around. The next thing you're going to need is a small pair of wire cutters, nippers, some people call them. These are very small. They're angle cutters, so they cut flat on this side right against something. And you need the small ones like this so that you can get into a circuit board and just cut off the excess. Real simple without maneuvering or worrying about cutting something else. These are the largest I would use for circuit boards. You might want to consider smaller ones. I do have a smaller set in my actual workshop. And then a good pair of small needle nose pliers for bending the wire, because sometimes you have to make little hooks in the end or little loops and different things like that. This will facilitate that because you can grab at the very tip here and twist and bend the wire. And we'll talk more about that when we actually get into the soldering. As I mentioned earlier, lighting. If you use a illuminated magnifier like this, not only will you get the lighting from the bulb buried in the bottom. Yes, I have rebuilt this one from the junk bin. And you will also get the magnifier to help you see what it is that you're working on, especially if you have old eyes like I do, and I just don't see that little stuff very well anymore. But a nice lighted magnifier, gooseneck, so you can position it where you need it to be, and it'll stay right there and you can see what you're doing. The larger the diameter of the magnifier, the better off you get, because we see distance perception with both eyes. If we only use one eye, we don't have any depth perception. And it's very handy when you're working small like that if you can put a bigger magnifying glass there where both eyes can see the point through the wideness of the magnifying glass. So don't be too cheap on the magnifying glass. If you've got really good eyes, like when I was young, this thing needs to be tightened. Yeah, you're just going to be difficult today. When I was younger, I could see that fine wiring stuff. Fine, you don't need a magnifying. Or some people prefer to wear magnifying glasses, much stronger than reading glasses or whatnot. I found the easiest way to get them is glasses are measured in diopters, okay? So go down to the local dollar store, go to their reading glass section, and buy the highest diopter number that you can find on the glasses for $1 or $2, and then wear them. Granted, you won't be able to see across the room, but you will have that nice binocular close-up view that fine work like this requires. As long as we're talking about vision and sighting, it's very, very important to wear safety glasses when you're soldering. For years and years I didn't, and I have burnt myself. I've dropped melted solder between my fingers, and all those little things that happen when you're working. And then it occurred to me one day that if any one of those accidents where I got burned had been in my eye, I would be blind in that eye. Molten lead will destroy your eye. Don't screw around. Wear safety glasses or full safety mask. It's either that or someday anticipate being blind. But that goes for any workshop project that you're doing. Safety glasses are extremely important. And the final piece of equipment we're going to talk about is a soldering board holder. Okay, this one is a cheap little one I picked up at a hobby store, and as you can see, I've had to replace the one alligator clip on it. This one's getting pretty funky, but basically you can twist it and turn it, and it's got ball joints all over the place so that you can bend them to whatever angles and that you need to hold the circuit board for when you're soldering. I actually go so far as I will, if I'm soldering two wires together, I'll put a wire in each one. Or if I'm tinning, which we'll discuss later, I'll put a wire in there just to hold it, to make everything steady so it doesn't move. So a good soldering holder. Now, this is one kind of a board holder. Uh, you see some pictures here of some other ones that are out there, ones that look more like a vise than that. You have to buy the one that works for you, or buy two or three. They're typically not that expensive. And use the one that's appropriate for you, for the job. There's times when I wish I had just a regular board holder. I do have one, but it's a piece of junk, and so I don't use it. I make do with this guy. And he is screwed down, as you can see, but you could do the same thing holding this to the tabletop with a C-clamp. Next, we're going to talk about solder, okay? If you've ever done any plumbing, working with copper tubing and stuff of that nature, or sheet metal, you probably have some acid core solder, and it's probably quite a bit thicker than this. Any acid core solder will not work with electronics. It will eventually destroy it. Okay, so what you need is rosin core solder. Okay, it's specifically made for electrical wiring and circuit boards. Okay, this happens to be a diameter of 0.031 inches, and it's also called 44. This happens to be by Kester. They make a lot of it. And this is a pound of solder. And this will probably last you, unless you do a lot of projects. I've had this for 30 years. Okay, it was right full to the top when I started. And as you can see, I got a long ways to go. So buy a good pound of solder, thin, and make sure it's rosin core, not acid core. Acid core will destroy your product, your project rather. So this is the solder that you want to have. Okay, now we're going to talk about wire. I showed you this piece of 24 gauge solid wire before. This wire is good for making connections on circuit boards and that because it's easy to work with, but it does not work good for anything that moves or has a lot of vibration, because being solid wire, it will break after X number of flexes. Okay. The second thing you have is stranded wire. Let me strip this back. Okay. Now you can see the stripped, the stranded wire here. Put it under the magnifying glass. And you can actually see, if I get these strands to open up so you can see them better, very fine wire. And there, I've kind of muxed it up a little bit, but you can see here that this is made up of a bunch of little strands of wire. Little strands of wire will flex a whole lot more than the thicker wire. All right? So you would use something like this on pieces that would move. Now you notice the coloration on this wire. This wire is special. If you can get it, it's really cheap if you can find it. This is a multi-cable. Alrighty, it's extremely small. It's probably 26 gauge, maybe even 28 gauge. Very small. And you see that it's colored in stripes and in pairs. And if you can get a bundle of it, it looks like this. And you can see there's green and white, and there's orange and brown, and there's purple and black, and etc., in these colors. All right? And all the colors are in pairs, and they're twisted together. So out of this bundle, you can pull, for instance, here is a red-green set. And notice that they're twisted together. So if I were to pull that out, they would slide right out, twisted together. This is the best wire you can get it. What this comes from, this particular bundle, is the old telephone push button. You know, you had 2 rows of 10 buttons on your telephone, and you had a big fat cable that came out of the back. If you can find any of that, get a chunk of it, 5-10 feet if you can get it, and then you'll be set with wire for, well, I haven't run out of it yet, but then again, I had about 50 feet when the company replaced the phone system we had. The stuff is getting rare, but if you can find it, it's really good wire to work with, and it's stranded. Now, that's wire, but not all wire is just simple chunks of wire like that. Sometimes you have stuff like this. This is jacketed wire. There's a gray jacket wrapped around the conductors inside. So let me pull the jacket back here a bit. Again, you use the strippers, but now you go to the other end. You have to be careful when stripping the jacket off that you don't cut the wires underneath. You want to cut only through the jacket. So I do that. Yeah, I know it's soldering 101, but we'll get some wire stripping in here. All righty. There we go. Now, you can see underneath the jacket there's wires. And you notice there's some foil in there and some other stuff. That's because this is shielded wire. There's going to be an uninsulated wire in there. And there's going to be some fibers, nylon fibers. The nylon fibers, if you get a hold of them, you can pull it down the jacket and just split it open, kind of like a zipper. And then the foil is electrically connected to the bare wires, and that's called a drain. So basically this is good for audio work, high frequency audio, very low frequency radio waves, but it's an unbalanced wire, so it's not good for things like antennas and that, but it's particularly good for audio work. Now there's 4 conductors inside of here plus the drain, okay, and they're each a different color, so you can pull different wires out of this or leave it as an intact cable. Each of these wires is stranded, slightly thicker than the wire that I was showing you earlier, but being stranded wire, very, very good wire. This, I happen to know that Home Depot carries in stock, and you can go down and buy X number of feet of it. So they have several jacketed type wires down there for burglar alarm, cell phone systems, doorbells, what have you, home automation. So that's one good source for that. Okay, now let's do some soldering. We're going to go through the steps. The first thing you need to do is get the iron up to temperature hot, and you should test that by melting just a little bit of solder on the tip. Yep, melted right on there, nice and fast. That's what we want. Now the next thing you're going to want to do is clean the tip. Now any metal thing will do, an old butter knife or that. I use the back side of my strippers, and basically you're just going to scrape the tip until you pretty much have shiny metal everywhere, okay? And then you're going to give it just a touch of solder on the tip to protect it, to seal it, okay? Now, the first thing we're going to do is we are going to tin the wire, okay? And you should do this with any stranded wire, and usually solid wire too, but definitely with stranded wire. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to take this, where we put that little dot of solder on there, and we're going to heat it up, and we want to touch the wire, the soldering iron to the wire. Notice my hand shake there. That comes with old age. Get used to it. Let me try this from a different angle. And this is why. Well, that's part of the problem. My little rubber handle slipped. There we go. Okay, so we're going to heat the wire at one end, and then we're going to melt the solder on the wire itself. We put a little dot there to transfer heat, but if it doesn't solder, if the solder doesn't melt on the wire, you will not get good bonding. And this is just being, there it goes. See how I'm putting the solder away from the soldering iron, but the wire is hot enough to melt it. And this is where you have to be fast. And I brush it a little bit to make sure, because you don't want big globs on it. If you have big globs, you're not going to be able to get it through holes in circuit boards and whatever, and it's just poor. So the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to do this other wire here. And put a little dot on there. And you can see the solder flows into the wires. Okay. Come on, a little better. Now I notice I tap this periodically, and you'll see down here all kinds of flecks of solder. It's because you don't want too much solder on your iron. Yeah, normally I don't have this much problem, but normally I don't have a camera in the way. All right, so let's put this down here. All righty. I don't know how much zoom we're going to get, but hey, we're going to give it a try. Okay, so that way you can see that the solder has flowed onto here. They're cool now, and hopefully if you do this right, it doesn't stay hot for long. Okay, so that's the first thing you're going to do is tinning. Now the next thing you want to do whenever you're going to solder something to something else is you're going to want to secure it. Okay? Yes, you can just touch and sometimes you have to. For instance, here's a piece of circuit board, and notice there's no holes or anything in this. There's just solder pads. There you would have to just surface solder. Okay, so you couldn't secure the wire. That's hard and it's fragile. This, on the other hand, this is perf board, and you can see that there's a number of holes in that. Okay, and each hole is surrounded by a little bit of copper pre-tinned for you. So what we would want to do, when I say secure it, if we were going to solder to the circuit board, is we would take this that we just tinned, it's nice and stiff now, and we would slide it through the hole and then bend it over. Like so. Okay, the back side. And then when you solder, yes, you've bent it over, it covers a couple of holes. And depending on what kind of connections you make, maybe you want to solder to both those holes, maybe you don't. Maybe you want to keep the one hole clean so you can stick another wire in there and then bridge it and make the two into one, whatever. But being secured here, you don't have to worry about holding the solder, holding the iron, holding the wire, all this is good, and you can just clamp it in. Now, okay, the first joint or connection that we're going to learn is known as a simple splice, also called a Y connection because, well, it makes like a Y. And we're going to take our wire, okay, the two pieces I just tinned, all right, we're going to hold them side by side with the insulation equal to each other. We'll use this magnifying glass more. Side by side, okay, then we're going to twist them. Twist them nice and tight. Now, if you're making Y connections, that is one time you could consider not tinning the wire first, because all of that stranded wire then will twist and interbraid into each other, and makes for a really good solder joint. Typically, if I'm making a Y connection like this, I do not tin it. That's the only exception. Otherwise, in everything I do, I tin it. But now we can see that the two pieces of wire are interconnected and twisted together. Now, we're going to clip them back into our holder here. Okay, we're going to take our soldering iron and we're going to give it a touch of solder. And again, we're looking at it to flow. So when you get done, it should look like one lumpy silver wire. Okay? One lumpy silver wire. That's a Y connection. Now we want to insulate it. You can't have these bare-ended wires flipping around and soldering everything. And there's two ways you can do it. One, you can take a little piece about, for this size, I'd make it about an inch and a quarter of black electrical tape. By the way, each layer of electrical tape, if it's UL listed, will insulate 600 volts. So typically you only need one layer for this kind of work. If you're working on high tension wires, say 10,000 volts, well, then you're going to need a lot more layers because 600, 600, 600, you reach 10,000. Okay, but you would start by bending your wire out into a T shape like this, okay, and you put the tape on here and fold it around underneath, and then either using a second piece of tape or by twisting it, then you would pull it back together into a Y and wrap around that way. That prevents the tape from just sliding off as it gets older and the glue gets bad. I don't like tape. I don't use tape anymore. Now I use something called heat shrink tubing. Heat shrink tubing comes in all different sizes and colors. And let's see, here's a black one. This is quite wide, quite big. Okay, I've got some even bigger ones, and I've also got some smaller ones. I'm looking for. All right, so you take a piece of the heat shrink tubing, and you cut off just a little bit longer than your connection's going to be here. So let me see. I want about that much. Cut that off with just a pair of scissors. Like I say, feels like a soda straw. Cuts that easy. All right, so I cut that off. Put the rest of this back with the other heat shrink tubing, or I'll be looking for that again. Okay, and then you slide the solder joint here, your solder joint up inside the heat shrink tubing. Now this is another place where your little tool here comes in handy, because get that balanced out there right where you want it to be, like so. And then it's called heat shrink tubing because it shrinks when you heat it. Some people use the barrel of a soldering iron to shrink it. I like a little butane lighter. Don't get too close because it is flammable. And then I will turn it over. And heat the other side. Notice I'm waving it back and forth as I don't want it to catch on fire. And you can get this in smaller sizes. You can get some that's the same size as this. And this one's a little too big for this size wire, but yep, it's secured. And so there, it won't come off. You can probably use a little bit of muscle and slide that off there if you ever have to service at this joint, but it will not come off because the glue dries out, okay? And it's much more compact, and it just looks better. So that is heat shrink tubing. Okay, now we're going to talk about a different kind of joint. Okay, this is the Y joint, very, very common. Now we're going to look at, and we're going to solder the other end of this wire with a different kind of joint. And this is called a Western Electric joint, because they invented it for their lines. This is when you need the ultimate in strength in your connection. And because they used it for connecting their aerial cables from one to another when they had to, when you got a quarter mile of wire stretched from pole to pole to pole and it gets cut, you want to be able to splice it without having to replace a quarter mile of wire. And so you strip back, and you strip back a fair amount of wire. You can see here, a fair amount of wire is stripped. Get the light here where it helps us. Should be using a magnifier. I don't have these problems. Fair amount of wire stripped back. Now, you take them and you make like an X. That elbow is just wore out or something. Might do something about that. Okay, you make an X, And this is where it gets different. Instead of twisting the two together, okay, you take one side and you twist it around the wire that it's joining to. And this is where you may need to use your needle nose if it's fine work. Then you take the other side and twist it around the other wire in the opposite direction. And it's hard to see right now, but see if we can get this in the magnifying glass there. But you have one wire wrapped around the other in each other, so that if they pull apart, if they pull against each other, and they're not soldered yet, so I don't want to pull too hard because they'll just unwrap, the two loops come up against each other. Now, once we solder this, I can already hear you saying, uh-oh, how's he going to put his heat shrink tubing on that? Well, simple, real easy, which I didn't do, and I could stop and do it right now, but it's all right. Put the heat shrink tubing on the wire before you do that. Just slide it back so it's out of the way. Okay. Alrighty, and then again, it's a long joint, but we want the long joint so we can use lots of solder, and we can make it strong. And again, so it flows. Once you get it to flowing, it'll flow like there's no tomorrow. And we now have a joint that looks like that. Okay? And it is very, very strong. And it is particularly good, like I say, if you're splicing the cable, particularly if it's an aerial cable or whatnot. Very, very strong joint. Okay? Now, the last joint that we're going to do is wiring, is we're going to wire, let's use this guy right here, a wire to a circuit board. And so we're going to clamp the circuit board, and let's clamp it this side, like so. And we're going to bring it down to where we can handle it, see it, bend it around. Stop fighting me. Yeah, I know, I tightened those up so they wouldn't slip. All right, so this is that piece of 24 gauge, 22 gauge solid that we had earlier, so it's a little stiff. And what we're going to do is we're going to take our needle nose and we're going to bend over just the end of it. Nice, sharp bend. Okay? And then we're going to put that in one of these holes. Now, of course, if we were making a circle, we'd know exactly which hole it is, but I'm just going to hit a hole and see what happens. Oh, get up in there. Pop, 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 pop. Okay, and then pinch it. So it's good joint. And as you can see, it actually holds the wire right out at an angle because it's a good tight fit. Now, this is a double-sided circuit board, so I have to decide, do I want to solder one side, the other side, or both? Well, because it's Smurf board, you might as well solder both sides the same. So first we're going to solder this one, and I'm going to see if I can't make a bad joint. Oh, too darn fast. See if I can't make the other side bad. that's a good joint right there. We'll look at the magnifying glass in a minute because I want to see if I can get a bad one on this side. I'm not having much luck getting bad one. There's a bad one. All righty. Now, get the magnifying glass here, and we'll look at the difference. By the way, a bad solder joint is also known as a cold solder joint. Get our magnifier around here. All right. Now, on this side, you will notice, move over. On this side, you will notice that this joint is nice and smooth. Yeah, actually, better at making that a bad one than I thought originally. Let me just fix that. There we go. That's good. Okay. You'll notice that this is nice and smooth. It looks like a little volcano of copper coming up out of there. And I don't know how well you can see that. I'll see if I can get some diagrams on this when I edit this video. All right. And it's nice and it flows in a mountain thing. Whereas this side here, you'll notice that the solder looks like it's good. It's hooked to the wire. It's hooked to the board. Everything looks hunky-dory, except it's a ball shape. Well, that's because it never flowed to truly attach metallurgically to the circuit board. And so that's going to be problematic. And if there's vibration here, that will eventually break loose. You may look at that and say, oh, it's soldered real good. But if you check it with a meter, you'll find out that it's almost an open circuit. Okay? If you have a cold solder joint, it's easy to fix. All you have to do is touch it with a soldering iron, heat it up, and there you go. Now it's a good solder joint. Okay, one last final thing. We said we'd talk about how you use solder along, even if you're going to be using terminals. Okay, this particular terminal is, it's got, show you the right side and then it'll make more sense. It's got holes where you slide the wires in and then screw terminals on the top where you tighten it. You're saying, so why would I need solder for that? Well, if you're working with stranded wire, the last thing you want to do is stick the wire in there, tighten it down, go to where in your circuit it doesn't work. Then when you get in there with a magnifying glass, you find out one little strand of that stranded wire is touching the next terminal over. So by twisting it and soldering it, you do two things. The first is you make sure all the strands are going to go in the terminal, not mushed out and touching something you don't want them to touch. Secondly, because it's now soldered, okay, when you tighten it down, you can get a nice tight grip on it because it's got some substance to it. Now, the other kind of terminal, which I looked and I don't readily have one to show you, but I'll see if I can dig up a picture, is a barrier strip. And that's where you've got a screw in the center and two walls on either side. And basically what you want to do there is you're going to wrap the wire around the screw. By the way, always wrap the wire around clockwise. So as you tighten the screw, it actually pulls the wire in instead of pushing it out. Anyway, the same thing applies. Stranded wire just flattens out. Some of the strands come loose. They short out to this or that. But if it's tinned, when you pull that around and tighten it, it's right there, and it's a good connection. If you have any questions about this or any of the information in any of my videos, there is a link in the comment section to how you can reach me. And good luck soldering your projects. Thank you.